Hey everyone, Eric here. Just before we get to the show today, I want to let you know about the big changes here on our team. We've now got 6 editors in both Asia and Africa producing some great journalism every day on what the Chinese are doing throughout the developing world. No one provides this kind of daily coverage about the Global South from the Global South. And that's why governments, think tanks, and investors around the world read our newsletter every day and rely on our website. If you'd like to find out what they're reading and get a truly unique perspective on China and the world, subscribe today. Subscriptions are super affordable, and you get 30 days free just to try it out. So go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. Once again, that's ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe.
The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Network from SupChina. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, we're joined by China Global South's managing editor, Cobus Van Staden, in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
And today we're also joined again by our Francophone editor, Geraud Neema. A very good afternoon to you, Geraud.
Good afternoon, Eric.
Well, we have both of our lead editors today with us, in part because there is so much going on, and when we have so many stories at once to cover, we need to do what we call the lightning round shows, and that's why we've brought Cobus and Geraud to share some of their insights on some of the big stories. Before we get started, though, I want to really extend a very heartfelt thank you to so many of our listeners. You can tell from my voice compared to last week that I'm doing a lot better. I am fully recovered from COVID. I had negative tests all this week, and you have no idea, Cobus. Both you guys have not had COVID yet. And one of the most disheartening parts of this whole process is that about a week into it, you kind of feel better. And you're just stuck inside because you're testing positive. And that was, to me, just absolutely driving me crazy. But after our show last week, where my voice was a little strained, I got a lot of nice feedback from everybody asking if I was okay. And so I am, and just a very big thank you. So today we're going to be talking about a lot of what's going on in the Chinese mining sector in Africa. And that's why we've asked Geraud to join us. When I say that it has been a truly miserable week for Chinese mining companies in Africa, never in the 12 years that we've been covering this have I seen a week like this. This has been remarkable in the scale of the setbacks that the Chinese have faced. First, Geraud, there is what happened in Guinea, and then let's talk about what happened in your native country in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Start us off with what's going on at the Simandou mine in Guinea.
So basically what's happening in Guinea, it's following of what's happened earlier in February when the junta in power in Guinea decided to stop the Simandou project ongoing because the government wanted the operators, the mining operators, the Australian Rio Tinto consortium and the other Chinese-led consortium SMB Winning to find an agreement on how they're going to build and finance the infrastructure. The infrastructure comprises of the railway, 670 kilometers from the east to the west, and a huge port in Conakry to where they're going to be evacuating the iron. So when they start in February, they say they find an agreement and they're going to be working on together. So they're going to create a joint venture, and then they're going to find a way to finance the project. 4 months into the discussion, and they still didn't find the agreement. In mid-June, the President Mamadi Doumbouya received the mining operators, warning them, giving them an ultimatum of 14 days to find an agreement. Otherwise, he will suspend the operation again. And 14 days later, no agreement, and yet he decided to suspend the operation. So basically, Rio Tinto consortium with China, the operation in Simandou has stopped. SMB Winning with China Aluminium in the Simandou project block 1 and 2, they also stopped. So basically, the operation is on halt, nothing is happening, and the Guinean government wants them to find an agreement. So from now on, we just don't know from where they're going to go from here.
Okay, so just give us a little bit of background for those folks who may not be familiar with the Simandou mine in Guinea, why it's important to the Chinese, and what's the significance of this deal.
So basically, Simandou is the alternative for China to free himself, to cut himself from the dependence from Australian iron ore, because so far China has been importing his iron from Australia. So Simandou is the largest iron reserve unexploited in the world. So China has bet a lot of money in that project. With that project, it's going to allow China to become free from Australian iron ore. So this is why we see a lot of Chinese presence in both sides of the deals, because we see Rio Tinto has partnered with Chinalco, and we see in SMB winnings, we see Shandong Weitia who is also present there. We see Chinese companies in the infrastructure, into building the infrastructure into the port and into even the railway. So we see a lot of Chinese presence there, because Simandou project is very capital, is a very strategic project for China in that regard, for to cut its dependence from Australia.
Is it accurate to see this as an African government essentially using their mineral resource to get a really good deal, kind of out of these, like knowing that China has this kind of geostrategic, agenda, or is the situation on the African government side a little bit more complicated than that?
We have to put in the context where we see the general trend into the mining sector, or not only in Africa. We also see that in Indonesia, where Indonesia halted the export of raw material for bauxite, so even for nickel, forcing Chinese company to open processing plants in Indonesia. We see the same thing happening in Zimbabwe, where another Chinese company has experienced the same blow, where the Zimbabwean government forced them to say, before doing anything, you have to commit. You're gonna be building processing plant in the country and producing lithium in the country. And the Guinea is also the same perspective. We saw that, especially with the new power, with the new regime, where they've been pushing a lot. We have to keep in mind that Simandou project has been, the project is not just moving on. Since 1997, when Rio Tinto got the first exploitation permit in 1997, 25 years later down the line, the project is still where it was. No really operation has started there. So the new regime came and said, we want things to move forward. We want things to move fast. But then we may ask ourselves why a transition regime as the one in power would want to push things forward now and fast as they want to move it now. That might be the question we might ask ourselves. There might be a local political agenda the regime wants to play in that regard.
Well, we'll get to the agendas very quickly, but you made a reference to what's going on in Zimbabwe, and this is an interesting side story that we've been following. The company you're referring to is Zhejiang Huayo Cobalt, which bought a $422 million lithium mine as part of the agreement with the Zimbabwean government. They said they were going to build vast amounts of infrastructure. The problem is that Zhejiang Huayo Cobalt has said now that the infrastructure costs would render the project unfeasible, economically unviable. Exactly. And so this is the problem, because many African countries, including the Democratic Republic of Congo, lack the power infrastructure to do the processing of the raw materials before export. So what Indonesia's been able to do by forcing Chinese companies to come and do the processing is due in part because Indonesia's infrastructure is at a higher stage of development than that in the DRC, in Guinea, or in Zimbabwe. So they've been able to exact that leverage over the Chinese. And it's going to be very interesting to watch the case in Zimbabwe to see whether Zhejiang Huayo Cobalt is able to continue to mine, or whether the Zimbabwean government says the contract's null and void. We're now going to find another partner who's willing to build the infrastructure. Let's go back to Guinea very quickly before we move on to the DRC. Let's talk about the different agendas here. You wrote to our subscribers yesterday in the newsletter. You said that the Chinese have one set of agendas. Again, you mentioned that about breaking their dependence on Australian iron ore. The irony here, of course, is that Rio Tinto is an Australian company. So that should be a little bit weird,
Exactly.
but okay. So that's the Chinese agenda. Very, very clear. They see the Simandou mine as a potential alternative to Australia. Even though, let's put this in context, the Australian market for the Chinese iron ore buyers is just enormous. I think it's something like 60+% of all Chinese iron ore buys come from Australia. So replacing the Australians is going to be very difficult. And Simandou has the potential to do that, but it will take many years to develop Simandou to get to that point. Let's talk about the Australian agenda related to the price of iron ore that right now is down sharply. And also, again, touch a little bit on the fact of the Guinean military government. They're under pressure to deliver results quickly.
Yeah.
So let's look at the three agendas and why this deal may have fallen apart the way it did.
Exactly. So we have different agenda here. We have Australian agenda. Rio Tinto has I would say, a more pure economic agenda that has to take into account the current price of the iron ore.
It's a profit-driven agenda.
Exactly. The iron ore market has been very unstable the last 6 and 9 months, and even the Queen Guinea even made the situation difficult for the iron market. And when you take into account all COVID restriction happened into China, also impacted the iron ore in general. So when you take that into account, Rio Tinto doesn't really have the motive or even the incentive to invest and to launch Simandou right now, because it's going to oversupply the markets. And the more you oversupply the market, the more the price is going to go down. And when the price goes down, in the same time, when they have to commit with Guinea, they have to increase the cost of production, because we are talking about billions in terms of infrastructure. They have to build 670 kilometers railway, 128 bridges and tunnels and everything, and not even mentioning the ports they have to build. So you have that cost that's really just too high to bear right now for Rio Tinto. And now, when you put that economic agenda aside, the profit-driven agenda, you also have the geopolitical part of it. I already mentioned it: China, Australia, and when Rio Tinto is partnering with the China in the business, we may understand that China would want to move forward, but Rio Tinto being the majority share in the project, they might slow the project to the displeasure of the Chinese partners. That's the geopolitical and the economic part of it. And when we go back now to the local politics of it, we may not understand why the regime wants to push the project right now, giving strict deadlines, because we haven't seen that in the last 25 years. The new regime has been pushing deadlines. So the perspective of becoming a political actors may be the one driving the regime right now, because the last month they said that they're gonna have 39 months of transition period, which is really quite long for many people in Guinea. But when the transition is over, if they plan to become political actors, they'd rather have some political agenda to show. They have results to show. And for them, Simandou is going to be a big win when they be able to say, as a military, we're able to move Simandou forward after 25 years. So us becoming political leaders, it just makes sense for you to elect us and to be with us. So there's also that part of the political agenda that may be driving the regime in Guinea to push with strict deadlines in that project.
So this is going to be a very important story to watch going forward. Keep your eyes on what happens in Guinea with the Chinese. Will they stay with Rio Tinto? Will they break away on their own to strike out a deal with the government themselves? The Chinese had already started to build some of that infrastructure, so it sounds like, as Geraud pointed out, that a lot of the frustrations that Conakry is having is with the Rio Tinto side and less with the SMB winning side. That's the Chinese part of the coalition. That said, this has been a contentious relationship for much of this year, and it will be interesting to see if it restarts. China has a very big imperative, again, to break its dependency on Australian iron ore to get this thing going. Let's leave Guinea aside for now and head south down to your former stomping grounds in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Again, another major setback for a major Chinese company. China Mali is CMOC. There's numbers of ways of calling this company. They are the 80% owners of the TFM mine in Kolwezi of cobalt and copper. This is the world's second largest cobalt mine. It is a major mine in the world of electric vehicle batteries. It is very important strategically for the Chinese. It is a major source of investment for the Chinese in the DRC, and it is also a major point of contention between the Congolese government, Gécamines, the state-owned mining company that owns 20% of TFM, and China Mali, or CMOC as it's called. So on July 3rd, the temporary court administrator of the project sent a letter to the different companies that said, we are halting exports of cobalt, and this has shut down. Now, to be fair here, according to Reuters, the representatives of CMOC said, we have not shut down our operations, we have not stopped extraction, we have not stopped exporting, everything is proceeding as usual. Typical for the DRC, Geraud. Nobody really knows what's going on. What we do know is that the trend lines for China Mali in TFM are not looking good. Bring us up to date now on the drama that's unfolding in Kolwezi.
Yes, it's a very another drama. Gécamines has succeeded to put in place the temporary administrator that was appointed by the court in February, and a few weeks ago he also said that he has a full control of the bank account, the financial of the company, but he still doesn't have the control of the production side, because the production side is still under control of CMOC, and the production side is protected by private companies and also by Congolese military on the ground. So that makes Gécamines really kind of in difficult position to get access to the production mine. That's why Vincent Joe, the spokesperson of CMOC, said, no, the production is still going. We still have the control of the production and nothing has stopped. But now the question is how CMOC is going to export its product out of the Congo, because Gécamines still has the card to play to stop the CMOC trucks to leave the country. Because so far CMOC can still produce, but from the production to leave the country, it's another problem where Gécamines still has some leverage over CMOC and TC and push them to stop export. So this is the real problem now they're facing now, because we have that situation where CMOC is, first of all, we have to admit that CMOC just set aside the court justice decision. It doesn't follow the ruling. They don't abide by that. Gécamines wants to play that card and say, we have to abide by the law. And CMOC doesn't want to let it go. And so far, we haven't seen so much political activity from CMOC yet, because before, you remember, when it started, we saw CMOC engaging with the prime minister, with the Congolese president. But for a few weeks now, almost a month, it's quiet. No political engagement, just the resistance on the ground. So we are really wondering what's going to happen from now, how they're going to move forward from now, because the more time passes, we just see that they're just going down the line to a very bad situation. Gécamines even went to mention that they may even think and consider dissolving the partnership.
Geraud, where does this dispute come from? How did it start, and where, and how do you think it's going to go into the future?
So basically, the dispute started last year in August when Gécamines wanted to see a bit clear on the reserve that CMOC was declaring, because Gécamines the cobalt and copper reserved in the ground. Gécamines has been accusing CMOC to underestimate the reserve. The accusation came from when CMOC announced they're going to invest $2.5 billion into the project. That's where the red flag came to the Gécamines and said, we don't understand that you're going to invest $2.5 billion into the project while the reserve that you're declaring don't match the numbers that you're giving us. So a commission was put in place under the presidency office, and they came to a conclusion that, yes, quote-unquote conclusion that, yes, CMOC is underestimating his reserve. They don't give the right numbers. And Gécamines say, based on the numbers that you owe, the real reserve you owe us, from different sources, the numbers go from 5 to 7 billion USD, which numbers that CMOC is totally contesting. They say it's not right. There needs to have an internal, a third party, an international third party to come to agree on that. But so far, they haven't been able to find an agreement on how and who's going to come to do that third party agreement, that third party evaluation on the situation on the reserve in TFM.
And just to be sure, sorry to interrupt you. There's no objective kind of government-run like surveying, kind of like outside. The surveying that's being done is done by CMOC, not by the government.
Exactly, and it's really interesting that you mentioned the government, because now they're into a level of distrust in a way that CMOC doesn't even trust that any result is going to come from a government-led body infrastructure and structure. That's why they've been pleading and asking, we want an international body, an international third party to come and to try to help us settle the disputes.
So this is not an issue that is new just to CMOC, Gécamines, and TFM. This is also the central issue that dates all the way back to the Kabila administration, that's before President Tshisekedi, with Sicomines as well, where they were accused of understating the quantity of reserves. And this is so important just so folks really understand what it means. So the idea here is that if the Chinese say there's 100 units of cobalt in the ground, and in reality there are 1,000 units of cobalt in the ground, but on paper they say there's 100 units. What ends up happening is that the Chinese then walk away with 1,000 units, sell all that money, but pay royalties back to the Congolese partner only for 100 units. Is that a correct understanding of it, right? So the Congolese feel like they're being robbed and ripped off and cheated.
Cheated on.
That's right. So here's the big problem, though. And this is, let's just get down to brass tacks here. And this is what I wrote yesterday in the newsletter as well. Gécamines may be unhappy with CMOC. Gécamines may want to stop CMOC from doing business. But at the end of the day, what options does an entity like Gécamines have to find a replacement for CMOC? It's not like Glencore or Ivanhoe. No one's lining up to spend billions of dollars on a cobalt mine, despite the fact that European, US, Korean, and Japanese governments have all said access to cobalt is a strategic imperative. The problem is they can't compel their private sector companies to fork over billions of dollars to buy into a very risky mining venture in the southern DRC. That's number one. Number two, is there another Chinese company that might step in? And would another Chinese company be any different in its behavior with Gécamines? What are the options that Gécamines has to play?
For now on, Gécamines, the only option, not the only option, they have the option to stop and export from the Congo, to block the trucks.
Okay, so they stop that, but that hurts them too, by the way. They're not getting any money. They're hurting themselves too.
Exactly, that hurts them a lot. That's a lot of $1 billion that you're not going to get. That hurts them a lot. And this is why we kind of wonder, in terms of the timeline, how long they can sustain in that situation. Because on the one hand, we have to admit that CMOC has the luxury of time. They can wait it off. They can even allow themselves to go to court. The proceeding can take time. But the Congolese, they cannot allow themselves to do that, because we are talking about 14% of world's cobalt production. TFM is a huge one. It's a huge cobalt project. It's hundreds of millions of dollars into the Congolese treasury. So are the Congolese ready to go and to sustain this kind of fight on the longer run? And don't forget that President Tshisekedi is running for presidency in 2023, and we just can kind of wonder, can he allow himself to find himself in that kind of situation while running for election in 2023, knowing that you won't have that much money to run for and to run with for the campaign?
And how much power does Tshisekedi have over this crisis?
Theoretically, he's the president. He should have a lot.
Theoretically, he's the president, but we all know that in reality, he's the mayor of Kinshasa, right?
Exactly.
I mean, he's not really the president of the entire country.
Exactly, because you have so many stakeholders, regional stakeholders in the Katanga region that have a tremendous power. Because, for example, why Gécamines is not capable of accessing CMOC ground? Because you have military on the ground who respond to other source of power into the DRC. That's quite it's quite surprising when you say, oh, why they come in as the justice decision with him, why they don't just go and take control of the ground. Because on the ground, reality is totally complex. You have security services who respond to other networks of power into the DRC that makes just so difficult for Jekamin to intervene on the ground without really coming with a lot of casualties that may come. So in terms of option that you mentioned earlier, different sources they've been saying that if China is considering even to take CIMOC of the project and to sell it to another Chinese company, that might be an option that Jekamin might consider. But we're still going to have to wait how much they're going to go into that. So far, the Chinese ambassador told us that they're not really willing to see CIMOC and Jekamin partnership to be dissolved.
You mentioned the Chinese ambassador. You spoke with Ambassador Zhu Jing this week, and so I was wondering kind of what spin he put on this crisis.
Yes, I spoke with him because I really wanted to have the Chinese side of the story, because so far we've been hearing a lot from Jekamin. The Congolese government is not speaking, and CIMOC executive are not speaking much about the issue. So based on how CIMOC is important both for both Congolese government and the Chinese government, I wanted to have his take on the issue. So I asked him what's the take on the issue. For him, he said the issue is quite simple to resolve if both sides come with good faith and said something along the line that the Congolese side, the Jekamin, should stop using a state apparatus to intimidate or even to force the situation on the ground. So basically, he gave me a quite diplomatic answer, but he also expressed his clear understanding of the situation, where he said that CIMOC is very important for both sides, the Congolese government and the Chinese government. This is why my question came, because I wanted to understand if down the line we may see Chinese government being involved directly into the talks with the Congolese government to find an agreement. Because the way situation is going on the ground, I really wonder if Jekamin and CIMOC will be able to solve the issue without political intervention from both sides.
That is the key question. Will this escalate to the geopolitics between Tshisekedi and, say, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, or even higher, even to the level of Xi Jinping, given the importance of cobalt? There was a graphic that was circulating this week by Standard & Poor's, which I think speaks to this, and showed the growth of the Chinese electric vehicle industry over the next 10 years, the domestic Chinese electric vehicle industry. Never mind the processing that companies like CATL and others, and Zhejiang Huayu, are doing for battery makers outside of China, but just inside China, and it is a hockey stick. I mean, it is just straight up. And so even though cobalt prices today are relatively flat along with nickel prices, lithium right now is the real prize out there. The price of lithium is just really very stubborn.
Skyrocketing.
Yeah, it's very, very high. So the question is, will this rise to geopolitics? And do you think there's a play here now for the U.S. and the Europeans to get in? China's on its back foot in the Congo with CIMOC. The Congolese are playing tough. Do you see a role for the U.S. and Europeans, or the Japanese and Koreans, or other players to make a move on TFM? Or is that just so far out of the question, wishful thinking, the fantasies of those in Washington, but in reality, they're never going to be close to it? What's the game that you see?
Now, I'm going to go straight. There's still no play for Western companies into the game. The game is still a Chinese game. And let's not forget that except CIMOC, it's a very funny situation. While CIMOC is fighting with Jekamin over TFM, it's the same CIMOC who, like last week, announced that they're going to invest 1.8 billion in another venture they have with Jekamin.
Amazing timing.
Exactly.
Like, you're going to pump in 1.8 billion on top of the 2.5 billion, okay? I mean,
exactly.
This is massive money coming into the Congo.
Exactly. So it shows you that they are not going to let go into TFM. They're not going to let go into the project. So this is why I say, no, there's no ground for Western companies. And you mentioned it earlier in terms of financial risk, in terms of political risk, in terms of so many risks on the ground. So far, the Chinese are the only one willing to come and play the game into DRC the way the game is played.
Well, let's come back to your conversation with Zhu Jing that Cobus referenced, and you chatted with him about the CIMOC issue. What are some of the other topics that you touched on in the interview.
Yeah, the other topic I touched on was about the US-China relationship between the DRC. You remember last year he had a quite spat with a former US diplomat, and I wanted to know what his reading on the situation. It just reminded us that DRC is a sovereign country, and they're free to engage with any country they want to, and China is willing to work with any country, Western countries, even the US on the ground, to work alongside with the Congolese government. But for them to do that, US has to forgo its obsolete Cold War mentality, and he was quite strong word against that with that, because he was clear that Cold War Chinese versus US mentality that may play on the continent, they're not just willing to play along with that on the ground. Except that we talk about the Chinese and DRC-China relationship, where he had the opportunity to give us everything that China has been doing on the ground, and how they've been helping, investing in the country. But there was an interesting thing I wanted to talk about him. To talk with him, it was about the Chinese stance on the situation on the east part of the DRC, because China is Congolese is a DRC ally in a certain way. We wanted to know what China can really do in that situation. He just reiterated China just wants the DRC sovereignty to be protected and respected, but except that, he did not give us much into what we were expecting him to give us.
That's not their thing.
Exactly,
that's not their thing.
Yeah.
They're not going to intervene. They're not going to take sides. They're not going. I mean, again, they're very close with the Kagame government in Rwanda as well. They have bigger strategic interests in the Congo, but they're not going to alienate the Rwandans either. Cobus, let's get your take on this. So we've had a half-hour discussion looking at what are some major setbacks for Chinese mining interests. Again, larger setbacks than I've ever seen before in the China-Africa experiment of the past 20 years. These are very big obstacles that they're facing, and the fact that they're happening within the same week is also very interesting. What's your big picture take on this?
What struck me in all of this is this trend that is how these kind of issues are playing out both in the private sector, public sector, which in China those two obviously sit a lot closer together. Kind of like there's a lot more coordination between the government, the party, and companies in China than you could see on the Western side. I was thinking as Geraud was talking, what's very interesting is the way that Western leadership or Western kind of influence in the world is so different from that of China, in the sense that with China, like everything is kind of party headed. Like the party sets the direction, and then in their complicated ways and in their own, like trying to fit into their own kind of profit agendas, companies follow that kind of broad direction setting. That's not really true in the case of a country like the US. When you speak to US diplomats in Africa, there's very few priorities for them that's higher than this issue of Chinese kind of Chinese focus on cobalt, in the way that China controls 80% of the world's cobalt refining. American diplomats are very worried about that. That's not necessarily the truth for American companies, and it becomes this very interesting kind of situation to see, kind of how this kind of power negotiation is happening, on the Western side of these issues. It's not so easy for governments to simply set an agenda and then have corporate partners follow that lead.
And to be fair, that's also the case in Europe, Japan, and South Korea as well.
Exactly.
I mean, that's not a uniquely American phenomenon.
Exactly. That that is the thing that they complain about when they talk about kind of Chinese shaping of the market and Chinese shaping of like forcing companies to do their bidding. So it's very interesting, but it's happening at this moment when global South governments are starting to become a lot more hardcore about wanting to refine at home and wanting to even kind of have production and IP development, located in their countries. So I wrote an article for Foreign Policy recently where I argued that there's the danger of us replicating, of us in trying to kind of kickstart a green revolution, and particularly via batteries, of replicating a kind of a 19th century dynamic of just exporting raw materials and having all of the actual wealth creation, i.e. the IP creation and the refining and so on, all happening in the global north. And that even though when you speak to Western diplomats, they talk a big game about wanting to avoid that. And actually, that's true for Chinese diplomats too. Like when you talk to them, all that they want to do is just to kind of like enrich the DRC and make it develop and so on. But when you actually compare their positions, that actually the Chinese and the Westerners are a lot closer together than either of them two are to the kind of this kind of global South push for relocating the IP to in the Southern Hemisphere.
Cobus, there's not a risk of that happening. It's happening. That's exactly what it is happening right now. I mean, the cobalt that's in my iPhone is the IP for that's all in Cupertino, California.
True, but at the moment we're still at the low end of that graph. Kind of like if one looks forward into the next 15 years, the kind of level of explosion of rechargeable batteries that we're going to need, the kind of the amount of manufacturing of those batteries that's going to happen over the next 15 years has the potential of turning a country like the DRC into something like Saudi Arabia, except that there are a lot of these barriers, including issues like stable electricity, for example.
Well, governance, I think, is the key issue there, and the fact that the DRC is effectively a failed state by many standards makes it impossible to achieve that goal. I think Asia is probably better positioned to lead on this. As Geraud pointed out, Indonesia has started to take the lead on forcing nickel and bauxite processing before it's exported. Other Southeast Asian countries are also starting to follow suit. And this is where it comes down to the governance question in Africa, though.
Governance is one thing, but another reason why Indonesia itself manages to do that is because it has a ton of Chinese-built power plants, almost all of which are coal-fired power plants.
Yeah, that's a good point. And now you can't get a Chinese-financed coal-fired power plant in Zimbabwe or elsewhere to process this stuff because the Chinese have banned financing for coal.
Yeah, but there's fine print there because they recently like the difference between funding and contracting is one of the kind of fine print areas, because they recently finished a coal-fired plant in Nigeria. Yeah. So we'll see what happens, but yeah, it's a real conundrum.
Yes, but what you mentioned earlier, Eric mentioned it was a governance issue, because in Indonesia they have the infrastructure in place, they have the electricity in place that the Chinese has built, but in Africa, Chinese companies, they may be willing to do that, but the political instability in Africa is just something that makes situation difficult. Even when you want to build the basic power plant infrastructure, you have to overcome so political constraint, corruption, and mismanagement that just makes the cost high for many. So that's why Chinese companies are just deciding to do the processing back home in China. That was one of the reasons that Zhejiang Huayu mentioned in Zimbabwe, by mentioning that the lack of know-how, but also the lack of power the power infrastructure in the country.
Yes, but this is where it gets so frustrating that African countries don't work more closely together. So yes, Geraud, you're absolutely right that corruption and limitations on power are a problem in some African countries. But let's be fair, it's not a problem across the entire continent.
No.
Kenya is rich in electricity, lots of renewable electricity. So imagine if there were sophisticated, robust rail lines that took, the cobalt from the DRC to either Tanzania or to Kenya and was processed in Kenya. Royalties were then kicked back into the DRC, and then processed cobalt left from the port of Mombasa. Imagine that kind of world.
Yes.
But we're not thinking like that. And African countries have made a terrible, terrible job of working collaboratively and regionally on these issues.
Exactly. Just let me give an example. Let's go back in Guinea. Why Guinea is asking companies to build the railway? Because Guinea doesn't want the Simandou iron ore to be exported from Buchanan port in Liberia. The railway is there, the port is there, but the Guinean, they just don't want the iron ore to be exported from Liberia. And that doesn't make sense.
Well,
it doesn't make sense.
So I've been in Washington now for the past 2 weeks. My first week here, unfortunately, was a complete loss due to COVID. But the second week, I've been out meeting people, think tanks, government, legislative teams. It's been absolutely fascinating. My head is spinning with all of the discussions that I've been having with people. And I come here every summer just to try and get the pulse of what people are thinking and saying. I can't give too many analyses right now because I just have too much bouncing around in my head. I have to let everything sit for a while, and then I'm going to share some views on this. But one of the points that came up over and over again in a number of the conversations is, why aren't African governments working closely together on, say, Chinese loans, on infrastructure with AFCFTA? Now, to be fair, it's starting to happen in some areas, so it's not universally that it's not happening. It's just not happening at the speed and scale to really make a big impact. Is that a fair assessment, Geraud?
Yes, it's a fair assessment, because that's the kind of cooperation we'd like to see more, pooling resources between, for example, Zambia and the DRC, Tanzania and the DRC, to create those infrastructure together, to pull those resources so they can benefit from it. But you have some regional and geopolitical interests that just send them in a way that they choose not to cooperate. It just doesn't make sense.
This is the dirty secret here. Algeria is buying Chinese drones because it hates Morocco.
And Morocco is buying weapons from China too.
There you go. And Nigeria and Ghana have problems. Rwanda and the DRC are having problems. Kenya and Somalia are having problems. I mean, we can go down the list. And so this idea of working collaboratively runs right up against national politics.
Exactly.
And Cobus, I don't know how you get around this, but at some point, each individual African country is so much weaker than a group. Is there any possibility that African countries and small groups can do what a lot of the American stakeholders that I'm talking with, they can work more collaboratively together? Do you think that's a realistic dream?
Well, at least, at the moment when international trade routes and trade relationships are falling apart, the continent managed to kick off a massive new free trade area. So I don't think it's impossible. It's just I think a lot of this will come down to finding ways to articulate kind of shared interests in a way that's more compelling than national culture or the nation state, and that's a really big challenge. But it's a big challenge in many places. I mean, kind of there's very similar kind of challenges in South America. And I've heard South American analysts saying that kind of that Africa is actually better at that at working together than in some cases in South America. So so this is like ASEAN there. Kind of is a great example because the issue is finding spaces of collaboration while not having everything blown up by these kind of structural disagreements that you have with neighbors, and so being very pragmatic in that respect. It's not much of an answer, but hopefully, it's a tough challenge.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly don't see that anywhere near as cohesively in Southeast Asia. Again, Southeast Asia in many ways is like Africa, which is a very large population, almost 600-700 million people spread across 10 countries. Africa obviously is much larger in terms of the numbers of countries. But the differences in language, ethnicity, religion, culture are so divergent and so diverse that it makes this type of cooperation very, very difficult. And again, this was asked to me as to whether or not these countries can work collaboratively together, not only within Africa, but then south-southwise. And I don't see that happening anywhere near as much as it probably should either. Do you, Cobus, see a lot of learning, say, from what Indonesia is doing or what Laos is doing with China in places like Africa?
I think there's more of it now than there used to be. I think, like it's like this kind of, like Geraud was pointing out, this, kind of taking a lead from or at least seeing similar trends pop up in places like Indonesia and parts of Africa, kind of, I think is an kind of an early indicator.
Well, that's certainly what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean we're back to some kind of like Bandung spirit, kind of, but it's, kind of at least, kind of there may well be some form of like knowledge sharing, but yeah, we'll have to see.
Okay, so quickly before we go, Geraud, a lot of these stories are unfolding this week. Give us a little preview of what you're looking at for next week.
So for next week, I'm going to be looking at and the following up on that story in Guinea and the DRC, because DRC basically it's become a story they want this, the saga just giving more and more and more into that. So we're going to be following that closely, and also in Guinea, what's going to come out of that. And for our Patreon community, we're gonna be sharing our insight on different on those different issues. And yes, we're also gonna expect our newsletter coming up next week. As for some of you who don't know, we have now start publishing our newsletter in French. So if you really want to receive those newsletters, just hit up with the message. We're gonna register you in the mailing list. You're gonna be receiving our our newsletter, our new weekly newsletter. It comes like twice a week, Tuesday and Friday, and to keep up with what we cover in China, Africa, and French.
So we're going to be updating the French website to make it very easy for you to sign up for this free twice weekly newsletter. It is fantastic. You're getting Geraud's insights and all of the latest China-Africa news en français. There's nothing else like it anywhere out there. We have a newsletter also coming in Arabic soon as well, so keep an eye out for that. Cobus, you are launching a column on Friday when this podcast launches. Tell us a little bit about some of the ideas you're working on for next week as well.
This column on Friday, I was kind of, reflecting on some of our conversations, just, in touching base on when you were in DC. And one of the points that you made was that, once you're in America, like all of these kind of international issues, like, for example, the extremely kind of developed and proactive kind of diplomacy that the Chinese have been doing in various parts of the global south over the last 2 weeks. We've seen like all of the heavy hitters, like very, very senior people in the Chinese government are all across the global south. They're meeting with people in Africa, in Asia, all over. And you made the point that all of that stuff completely falls off the radar the moment you're in the US. And just news, just in terms of news coverage, and I made the point that it's actually very similar here in South Africa, simply because South Africans are so obsessed with how difficult life is now because the electricity grid is essentially falling apart. So you have a situation where people do very sophisticated work. It's like working for international TV networks or like doing very high level analysis, but they have to like trek across the city back and forth to find different places where they can keep being on Wi-Fi because the electricity keeps going out everywhere we go. So it's that kind of situation where even as these massive developments are happening, these kind of bread and butter day-to-day issues are keeping people distracted enough that they can't have any kind of real kind of participation in it, even when it directly affects them. And part of this thinking, and this is what I'm continuing into next week, is I'm becoming increasingly obsessed with the Global Development Initiative. This is Xi Jinping's recently announced kind of like new phase of the BRI. And it's twinned with the Global Security Initiative. So it's both development and security, and because it's China, kind of secure, like kind of a security development nexus that is essentially being presented as the kind of building the future, kind of to the global south. It's only starting now. It's being very heavily promoted by the party, and it's the new centerpiece of Xi Jinping's international outreach. And it's fascinating to see how they kind of like looking at development itself as this, kind of in the context of a kind of a wider geopolitical struggle, and how development is essentially becoming this space for geopolitics. So this is something that I'm looking at a lot this the coming week.
And we have a conversation coming up next week with two experts on China's discourse power in the Global South. And Global Development Initiative is a major part of changing that discourse, changing the discussion about development that has up until now been largely dominated by U.S. and European institutions. And so the Chinese, with the GDI and with the Global Security Initiative, want to impact the discourse And we're going to be talking with two experts on that next week. So lots of cool stuff coming up next week. I'll still be in Washington next week, meeting with people. Again, I'm going to start sharing some of the conclusions and the thoughts about it. But I'll tell you, as an American who doesn't live in the United States, it's weird being back. I mean, I was on the Washington subway yesterday, and I'm not the only person that was thinking this, okay? I am sure that I'm not the only person who was thinking this. Who's going to pull out a gun and start shooting? Seriously. It's a form of terrorism, and I've never really felt it like this. But again, we had another shooting in Highland Park in Illinois over July 4th weekend. Just so random. I mean, it was at a July 4th parade, and the randomness of it is the terrorism of it all. You're just at the mercy of one asshole who's having a bad mental health day and has a gun.
Exactly.
And that is not the case in most other countries in the world. Even in the DRC when I lived there.
That's not the case in China.
Certainly not the case in China. China has its weirdness on stabbings and things like that, but not at the scale. But it's not at the scale of what we're seeing in the United States on guns. And it's created this fear and anxiety that you look around and we're becoming a low-trust society. And the United States was always among the higher trust societies. But in many developing countries, there's low-trust societies where there are weak governance institutions, and the goal is to keep you away from me. That is oftentimes in many developing societies where you don't have a proper criminal justice system, so you always worry about people taking the law into their own hands. And that's certainly the case in many of the developing countries I've lived in. The United States, in many respects, feels like it's becoming that. And it's a weird anxiety. It's a weird feeling to be looking suspiciously at everybody around you going, is that the exit I take? What if I duck here? Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
So weird. And again, this impacts us geopolitically as well because it's a rot in the society. And one of the challenges that I've been having these conversations with American diplomats is the challenge that they face. And Cobus, you wrote about this a couple of weeks ago. Pity the poor American diplomat who has to go out and represent a country that domestically is pulling itself apart and ripping itself apart violently in many respects.
Yeah, especially because the United States, like one of its hallmarks is its incredible level of transparency, kind of, and its incredible level of kind of self-commentary, And so even as all of this is happening, everyone is watching it happen in real time. It cycles around the world within seconds, kind of the moment that kind of thing happens. But then the messaging doesn't seem that the diplomatic messaging, I think, finds it very difficult to incorporate these realities, or to explain them.
It's interesting that you bring that up because, someone raised the very interesting point that if something like this happened in Gansu, China, for example, we wouldn't know about it.
Exactly.
There's no foreign media to report on it. There's a big language barrier. There's enormous amounts of censorship. And if it made the party look bad, they would shut it down quickly.
Exactly.
And as they have. Yes, from time to time, things like the beatings in Tangshan, that was the terrible incident where women were violently assaulted by a group of 8 to 10 men. That did make it out. That was horrible, but that doesn't happen very often. China's not a transparent society like that. So a lot of American stakeholders were lamenting the fact that you've just made, Cobus, that it seems worse here because we're more transparent and more open about it. I think the problem that a lot of people in other countries have, though, is that the United States also holds itself up as the benchmark, the standard for everybody else.
Exactly.
Our environmental standards, our governance standards, our democracy standards, etc., and not taking into account that many of those standards are under pressure.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court dealt a huge setback on environment. I was at a talk by Wendy Sherman in Vietnam a few weeks ago, and she was holding up the U.S. as a leader in climate issues. And you're like, well, wait a minute. Your Supreme Court literally that week dealt a major blow to U.S. climate change efforts. And that discrepancy often isn't held to account in U.S. foreign policy. And that's a challenge. Again, pity the poor American diplomat, no doubt.
Yeah, and I mean, but that kind of cognitive dissonance, I think, is becoming one of the big kind of issues, big political issues within the U.S. as well. That it's going to be a major liability, I think, for any kind of like Biden run, and if it happens. And yeah, don't know how to solve that problem,
No, but we'll talk more about this in the weeks ahead, because again, I do want to share some of my reflections of the week here. I'll be heading out to California for a couple of weeks there to wait for my new passport before I can go back home. And I'm eager to get back home. I'll tell you that right now. Home is Vietnam. Home is not the U.S. So that's exciting. Anyway, let's leave the conversation there. A very big thank you. We've got some new Patreon supporters this week. You have no idea how much it means to me and to all of us on the team. 8 members on this team. When you support us on Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/China Africa Project. You'll get our weekly digest that we email out. Also, Cobus and Geraud have promised me, and I'm going to force you guys now in front of everybody to commit that you're going to commit right here in front of everybody else. I've been haggling these guys for, just hassling them for weeks now, to contribute more to our Patreon community. And it's a great group of people there. We're having some great discussions, and we're just so grateful for your support. All of the discussions that we've had over the past hour are ideas that we feature first in our newsletters, on our sites, on Projet Afrique Chine in French, also on our English site at China Global South, and in the newsletter. Cobus's ideas, his columns every week, the news that we're all writing. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. Subscriptions are super cheap. You're also supporting independent journalists, independent analysts. We have 8 of us in the Global South that are working so hard every day to put this content out for you. Your support, your subscription helps to support us as an independent journalism entity. It helps support Geraud, Nesrine in Cairo, and our team in China, as well as Chris in Cape Town and Cobus in Johannesburg and myself in Vietnam. We write from the Global South for the Global South, and we certainly appreciate all of your support. So go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe to sign up. Subscriptions are, again, super cheap. You know what, guys? Just before we go, a subscription to the China Africa Project for students and teachers is $7. You cannot walk out of a Starbucks in the United States for less than $10.
I've first-hand experience of current Starbucks pricing.
You cannot walk out of a Starbucks for less than $10. I mean, if you get a drink and a piece of food, you're at $15. So by that standard, our subscription is a great value. So let's leave our conversation there. Cobus, Geraud, and I will be back again next week. We're online all the time. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter at ChinaGS Project and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and Afrique Chine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.